What if the 10 plagues of Exodus weren't random disasters, but a calculated assault on Egypt's most sacred beliefs? In this video, we're uncovering the hidden strategy and mythology behind the first 3 of these ancient catastrophes. And by the end of this video, you'll see how each plague was a direct attack on Egyptian religion and gods. So let's dive right in. Now, the first plague is the Lord turning the Nile River into blood. And this is a big deal because the Nile was the source of all Egyptian life. Everything depended on the annual flooding of the Nile. This is known in scholarship as the inundation, where rich silt or soil would be deposited along the banks of the Nile for the growing of crops, which is important because you've got to eat to stay alive. And because of this, the Nile, and more specifically the annual flooding, was deified and personified and known by the name Hapi. And Egyptians as early as the pyramid text referred to the Nile by the name Hapi. And it was Hapi who was said to have kept Egypt alive. Therefore, when the Nile turns to blood, this is really problematic because it means that Hapi is not in control of the Nile River. He's not able to perform his job. And what's worse for an Egyptian is that this means that the God of the Israelites, whom Moses is representing, is actually the one who is in control of the Nile River. And it's not just undermining Hapi, because in Egyptian religion, Pharaoh is both the son of Re, or Ra, and the incarnate god Horus. And he was in charge of maintaining the order of Egypt, known as Ma'at, which was established at the first creation. So what this first plague does is it sets the stage for a public display of humiliation for both Pharaoh as well as the gods of Egypt. And this is done through a series of 10 plagues that describe a decreation narrative of Egyptian religion, theology, and worldview. However, Pharaoh does have a set of helpers. These are his magicians, which is really an unfortunate translation. They're better understood as his chief priests. And these chief priests are able to replicate this first plague of turning water into blood. And this is important because part of these chief priests' role was to assist Pharaoh in the maintaining of Ma'at, or order. While this is usually understood as a tie between the Lord and these magicians or these chief priests, because they matched what the God of the Israelites did, albeit on a much smaller scale, this is actually a major defeat. Because what they should have done was restore order by returning the Nile to its original state. But these priests end up adding to the problem and creating more blood. And this same thing happens in the second plague, when frogs begin to overrun Egypt. These chief priests are able to replicate the plague of frogs. But once again, this is a major problem because neither they or Pharaoh fix the problem of restoring Ma'at. They simply add to the problem. And again, it's not just Pharaoh or these priests who are falling short. It's the gods. And specifically, in this case, it's the goddess Heqet. She is a goddess who is depicted as having a female body with a frog's head. And she blew the breath of life into human beings after her spouse, Kinnim, fashioned them on his potter's wheel. And she was also associated with and assisted as the midwife at birth, which this does link back to earlier in the Exodus narrative when it talks about the Hebrew midwives. But most importantly for this discussion, the goddess Heqet had the responsibility to control the multiplication of frogs in Egypt. And these frogs were a symbol of both divine power as well as fertility. And to an Egyptian, when the frogs are out of control and unregulated, it means that just like Hapi, Heqet is not performing her proper function. And moreover, it means that the God of the Israelites, who has sent these frogs through means of Moses and Aaron, actually has superiority over Heqet. She is not in control of the frog population in Egypt. It is the God of the Israelites who is. And it means that once again, the Lord is demonstrating his authority over the Egyptian deities. He is the one who is in control of the frog population, and he is the one who is in control of fertility, not Heqet. Now here's where we see a transition with the third plague. This is the plague of gnats, and these gnats are everywhere. There is only speculation that this is an attack on an Egyptian deity, and that would potentially be Khepre, who is symbolized by the flying beetle, also known as the scarab or the dung beetle. And Khepre was associated with this specific beetle, as well as with the morning or the rising sun. However, rather than this potentially being an attack on a specific deity within Egypt, what is more likely is that this is actually an attack on Egypt's religious system, and specifically the priest within Egypt. More on that here shortly. First, let's talk about how this plague begins. And just as with the first 2 plagues, this one begins with the Lord instructing Moses to tell Aaron to stretch out his staff, which is followed by Aaron doing so. And this initiates the plague. By the way, this literary feature is why I am doing the plagues in sets of 3 and saving number 10 for itself. So if you want me to do a video on the literary structure of the plagues, let me know in the comments below. All right, back to the third plague. Now, the Hebrew behind where we get the translation of gnat is the word kinnim. And while this term is not clear in meaning, we do know that this is some type of flying insect. And these kinnim, or gnats, are a major problem for the proper function of Egyptian religion. And that is because the Egyptian priests can no longer serve Egypt's gods in the temples, because these kinnim, or gnats, make them ritually unclean. And this comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who noted that, quote, there, referring to Egypt's, priests shave the whole body every other day, so that no lice or anything else foul may infest them as they attend upon the gods. So in other words, none of the priestly duties in Egypt can be carried out, which means that the gods are essentially abandoned. And these priestly responsibilities and obligations were essential to maintaining ma'at, or order. And furthermore, this is where Pharaoh's chief priest's ability to replicate the plagues ends, which yet again is another double attack on Egypt's religious system. Because not only are these priests ritually unclean, they can no longer perform miracles, something they were supposed to be able to do according to Egyptian texts. And they are unable to restore ma'at. They even admit to Pharaoh, quote, this is the finger of God. And so what we have here in the third plague is gnats infesting the land, which make the priests of Egypt ritually unclean to serve in the temples, thus abandoning the gods of Egypt. And in the second plague, we saw the goddess Heqet unable to maintain the frog population, when the god of the Israelites multiplies frogs across the land. And in plague number 1, we saw the Nile, the very source of Egyptian life, turn to blood, and the deity Hapi, who was associated with the Nile, was unable to restore it. All right, everyone, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to check out one of these videos that YouTube thinks you're going to like, and I'll see you on the next one when we cover plagues 4 through 6. Thanks so much.